Welcome to UofL Today with Mark Hebert on Cards Radio 790 WKRD in Louisville. On the show today, researchers and therapists at UofL's Kentucky Spinal Cord Injury Research Center are doing amazing work. They're getting paraplegics to stand and take steps. They're also working with children who have spinal cord injuries, and we'll hear some of the awesome work they're doing, including a new tool to help those kids get on their feet. But first, there's a push in virtually every state to legalize marijuana. But a massive study done by researchers at UofL and other schools has found marijuana with a big impact on health concerns as well as an impact on hospital emergency rooms. Paul Clark is an assistant professor in the UofL School of Nursing who has worked on that study. Paul, good to see you.
Great to be here, Mark. Thank you.
Glad you're here. And I knew you got a little bit of an interesting career path here to become a nurse, didn't you?
I did. I started out, actually, I'm a second career nurse, but I'm also a Franciscan brother. So I went through the Franciscans, got all my theological training out of the way, went to nursing school, got a PhD in 2010, and then did an administrative job with the Franciscans for 4 years before starting full-time at University of Louisville.
And how old were you when you started at UofL?
Let's see. So that was 6 years ago, 46.
46 years old, you'd become a nurse, basically.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, well, good for you. I've done some stories on some folks that have, become second career doctors, nurses, those kinds of things. So maybe you found your calling.
I did.
Just took a little while, huh?
Exactly. I tell people it took me until I was in my mid-40s until I figured out what I wanted to do when I grew up.
When you grew up, that's right. All right. Well, this was just incredibly interesting to me, this study that you did on what the legalization of marijuana has meant on nursing workloads and other factors in states that have legalized marijuana. So why don't you talk a little bit about the study to start with, and then we'll get into some more specific questions.
Sure. So I'm a member of the Emergency Nurses Association, and I'm on the Institute of Emergency Nursing Research. Our director is Dr. Lisa Wolf. And what we do for the organization, for the ENA, is to help research problems that emergency nurses find perplexing and try to find some solutions to that. I think actually we may be the only professional nursing organization that has its own research arm. Exactly. So we looked into the effects of marijuana, the legalization of marijuana on emergency department nursing practice in states where marijuana was legalized, as well as bordering states, which might not sound like a lot, except Canada, there's both recreational and medical marijuana is legal. And in Mexico, medical marijuana is legal, but recreational marijuana use, while not legal, the law that prohibits it was unconstitutional. So they don't support it. So
you didn't just look at the states that have recreational marijuana. Right. You looked at the ones that have medical, which is far more states. What, 40-something states? I think?
A lot of states.
Yeah.
Yes,
okay.
exactly.
So you looked at all them and their surrounding states. All right.
Exactly.
So that was what was the point of the study? What did you want to figure out?
We wanted to understand how marijuana use impacts emergency department nurses' practice. Good, bad, indifferent, and like most things, we found good and bad. So just to give you a little background on the research study, it's a qualitative study. So we took 24 nurses that attended our National Emergency Nursing Conference in 2018 in Pittsburgh. We interviewed them, several of us on the Institute of Emergency Nursing Research, and we asked them very specific questions like, how did your practice change? How has marijuana use affected the way that you deal with patients? What are patients coming in with that you see that are different? And we got some really fabulous results.
Yes, you did. Fabulous and interesting.
Some
of them surprised me, frankly. Mm-hmm. All right. So what were the types of things that the nurses reported that they were seeing in their emergency rooms in the states where marijuana is legal that were different than what they saw before that state legalized marijuana?
So as I'm sitting and listening to those interviews, I'm like a little kid at Christmas. In fact, our director says to when we get these results, she's like, sometimes these results, while they're really great, sometimes they're not so fabulous to hear the the results. She says, this is the most horrible Christmas present we could have. It's such a gift, but it's like so crazy to see. And as I'm listening to them, I'm thinking, these were the things that really stood out to me. Like the first one was, patients come in, and they're typically younger, so they wouldn't be presenting to the emergency department specifically because they've got abdominal pain, right? Mm-hmm. They take Pepto-Bismol, they take some Tylenol, the pain goes away, but now they've got this crushing abdominal pain. And in some instances, they feel like they've got really bad problems, like maybe cancer, like maybe they've got some kind of
pancreatitis or something.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly. And so really what they're experiencing is a marijuana hangover. So they overconsume marijuana, they have incredible abdominal pain. And what the nurses told us, what the patients told them was, marijuana is supposed to stop nausea, right? So I've got really bad nausea and my abdomen hurts. It must be something going on in my abdomen. And what we're finding is, no, it's really just overconsumption that's causing this pain. So we've got younger
patients. So they're getting drunk on marijuana.
Basically, right. It would be like over-consuming alcohol. So having, like way over-consuming, let's say 6, 8 shots of bourbon, and then you wake up the next morning with a bad headache and think you've got a brain tumor, right? So people come in and they're doing that, and we do a minimum workup. We say the physicians say we've done all we can do, and these patients insist. So we do expensive CAT scans and expensive MRIs, and we do more blood work than we normally would do, and so it's driving up the costs.
All right, some other things. What are give me bam, bam, bam. What are some of the other findings that the nurses came up with that perhaps we wouldn't even think of, or some concerns that have been raised about marijuana versus dealing with alcohol-related hangovers, for lack of a better term, or overdoses?
Sure. So pediatric population. So we have pediatric patients that are coming in who are badly intoxicated because of edibles like gummy bears.
So they accidentally got into mom and dad's gummy bears that had marijuana in them.
Exactly.
Oh, jeez.
Exactly. And there's a lot of other edibles like baked goods, brownies, cookies, things that are appealing to all of us, but especially to children. They eat these, and their bodies are not set up to handle that level of marijuana. So in some instances, our study found one person reported several instances of where patients either died or where they had to be intubated. So they had to have a tube placed in their lungs to help them breathe until they could get through the overdose. In one instance, they reported several infant deaths where it wasn't so much that the infants had consumed, but the families had consumed, and they co-bedded, meaning that the infants stayed in the same bed with the parent. And because the parent was so relaxed, and this happens even when there's not marijuana intoxication, the parent rolls over on top of the child and the child suffocates. So it wasn't just the pediatric patient consuming, but the parent consuming and co-bedding, which led to deaths. Another from one end of the population to the other, so geriatric population. So either patients that are in their 70s, 80s, 90s see a brownie laying around and they consume, and they either don't know it has THC or they do know it has THC, and it takes 20 to 40 minutes for the effects to start to hit. So after 10 minutes, they're like, that didn't do anything for me, and they consume another one. And then they have, because they're either overconsumed or overdosed, they have pretty significant neurological symptoms like strokes. So they come in, and we think they're having a stroke, so we do a very expensive medical workup, when really it's an overconsumption issue that doesn't require CAT scans and extensive blood work.
Right. So what do ERs do? What should nurses be doing in the ER when they do figure out, somebody's just walking in with a marijuana overdose, for lack of a better term?
Exactly. So I think the nurses reported to us that because marijuana is so widely used, they don't even screen for it anymore. I think emergency nurses should screen for that. They should ask their patients, do you consume marijuana? I think one of the behind the scenes or the quiet portions of the study that we found was that there is somewhat of a bias against, or a perception that there's a bias against people that use marijuana products. And nurses can't be judgy about that. Consuming marijuana is neither here nor there. It just is.
And legal in many states.
And legal in many states, exactly. So we need to get the truth, from the patients, so we know what to communicate to the healthcare team, to the physicians and other providers. I think nurses need, and they've expressed this, we don't need to just write somebody off immediately and say, they've just got this marijuana hangover, and ignore a really potential like appendicitis or, some kind of intestinal issue. There has to be, I think, probably more clearer screening, but we shouldn't be judgy. So I know my background is as an emergency nurse, and I can we see a high volume of patients, and we start saying, that person's just this, or this person's just that. We really have to be careful in our differential diagnosis to figure out what's going on.
Talking with Paul Clark from the UofL School of Nursing about the study he did on marijuana and usage and overdoses in the ER in states that have legalized marijuana and surrounding states. So what's the education portion of this? You already talked a little bit about what nurses should be doing when these patients walk in and doing better screening, those kinds of things. What should marijuana smokers perhaps be doing, and what should they know about symptoms? Because I don't think most marijuana smokers have heard much about, you can basically overdose on marijuana.
Exactly.
So what's the education portion here?
So a couple levels of education. For consumers, what is the dosage that they're smoking or that they're consuming? Because there's edibles, things they can eat. There's drinkables. There's root beers. There's sodas. We all know with CBD oil, there's oils. There's also THC oils. There's vaping, THC vape. People can vape THC. So I think consumers need to know what their what the dose is that they're taking. For instance,
can you know though? I mean, is there any way to know? Because marijuana, if you get marijuana from one place, it's got a lot of THC in it, and the next marijuana cigarette you smoke might not have as much THC.
You hit the nail on the head. Producers, there's not a standard dosage, and producers sometimes don't put that dosage information on their packaging. So they might have a brownie that's super high in THC, and maybe they sell something that they smoke that's much lower in THC. Similar to high alcohol beers, low alcohol beers, depending
Same
on
thing, yeah.
Exactly. I think what would be helpful for consumers to understand is just like you don't equate a 12-ounce bourbon with a 12-ounce beer. You have to understand the level of THC in all the products that are consumed, whether it's smoked, eaten, drank, etc. And I think to understand also a brownie might have 10 milligrams of THC. What does that mean? Well, a standard dose might be 2.5 milligrams to get a change in sensation. They're almost quadrupling that. And then if they eat 2 brownies, they're 8 times. That's 8 times what they should have. So consumers need to be educated about dosages, what their products, how much THC their products have. We providers need to understand better what the products are, including, I've mentioned a couple, but there's also tinctures and there's oils. So we need to understand when a patient says I've had a tincture or I did a drinkable, I did a 12-ounce drinkable. We need to understand better what that means. And we need to understand I don't think really we understand the whole marijuana hangover or THC hangover that people have with their abdomens.
I think you're right.
We need to better understand that can't be blown off. We have to pay attention to it. But we also have to educate our patients that it might not require an expensive workup, just as we wouldn't do an expensive workup for a really bad headache after overconsumption of alcohol. Yeah.
And one thing we haven't even mentioned there were some good things that came out of this study that nurses reported in the ER,
Absolutely.
right? You got a lot
Absolutely.
of chilled out patients showing up in the ER, right?
Especially our methamphetamine users, who would typically be very difficult to deal with in the ER. Meth is illegal. They switched to marijuana because it was legal. They became much more easier to deal with. Now, doesn't mean that they came in and they were total angels, but they were certainly much easier to deal with, as were those who consumed synthetic marijuana products. And they also have their significant psychiatric issues with those patients when they started consuming regular old marijuana. Much easier to deal with. So, yeah.
All right, the message to states like Kentucky that haven't approved marijuana, you got this battle going on about whether, the medical marijuana should be approved, those kinds of things. What's the message that you take from this study to pass along to states who do not have legalized marijuana right now?
I think the lesson is when there's regulation, there has to be an understanding of what the dosage is, what the dosage can do, how much each product contains. And there has to be some regulation in packaging. So if gummy bears are sold in clear plastic baggies that are available to children can see into those, there might need to be a different kind of packaging for those products to keep them separated from pediatrics patients or from adults who don't realize what they're consuming. So I think it really comes down to it just can't be approved and we hope everything goes okay. I think states can look at some of the studies like we've done, learn from the mistakes that have been made in other places, and then when they build those practices into their regulation to keep us safe when that's actually approved.
And the message to the marijuana smokers is if you get a stomach ache, yes, it really could be that you smoke too much marijuana.
It could be. It could be. We need to be cautious to make sure that you're safe, but don't just assume you've got a bad abdominal tumor because it may be related to the marijuana.
Okay, good deal. Paul Clark, good talking to you. Interesting stuff. The University of Louisville has the Kentucky Spinal Cord Injury Research Center. We call it KSHIR. It's a world-renowned center which has made remarkable and groundbreaking discoveries in getting paraplegics to stand and take steps again. Andrea Behrman is a professor in the Spinal Cord Injury Research Center, and she works specifically with children with spinal cord injuries. Andrea, good to see you, as always.
Good to be back. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Sure. You do some amazing stuff, you and your team, don't you? I call it amazing. I can use that word. You can call it amazing.
I appreciate that word. Remarkable sometimes, I think, is maybe a good way. Unexpected is another
That's a good word.
way to look at it. For many parents of children with spinal cord injury, I think we provide hope, real hope.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's talk about, just in broad terms, what you do. What do you do at the Kentucky Spinal Cord Injury Research Center?
Well, in fact, I have two things that I do. Okay. One is lead a clinical program. So it's an outpatient therapy program for children with spinal cord injury. Mm-hmm. And the second is lead a research program. So in parallel, together, what we do is try and discover through science new ways to help children recover from spinal cord injury and then translate those rapidly into clinical practice. Mm-hmm.
And I know you work with Susie Harkimer a lot, who heads the team, but she just works on adults with spinal cord injuries, right?
That's correct, 18 and older.
Okay, and you're 18 and under, or 17 and under, I guess?
And under, that's right.
So
all the way down to 18 months.
All right, so we've heard remarkable stories, your word, about what's going on with adults a lot. And we've heard sometimes about what you're doing with kids. So we've heard about Susie Harkema and what K-Shirk is doing with the adults who have spinal cord injuries, and how they've now got to the point where some of them are standing on their own, taking steps on their own. I mean, just incredible stuff if you got a spinal cord injury. So what's the progress right now that you're having with kids? Where are you in the process, and where are you working towards?
So I would say it's we use some of the same modalities or therapies that have been designed for adults in children. It may be that children are, in a way, even more responsive. Just, children are very adaptable. They're still growing and learning. Their nervous system is still developing, in fact. So in some ways, it gives us a bit of advantage during that period to work with children. So one of those therapies is what we call locomotor training. And we use a specific type of equipment that we're going to talk about shortly. But the whole idea of that training is what we've understood from scientists, that the spinal cord itself is smart. Now, it's almost an oxymoron.
Does it have a brain?
Yeah, that's right. It's almost an oxymoron to say it. Susan Harkin would say it may be smarter than the brain.
Okay.
So what does the brain do? It processes information. It listens. It integrates and synthesizes all that information. It can make decisions. Well, it turns out the spinal cord is very similar to that. And it receives information from the brain, but it also receives information, what we say the periphery, or sensory information. So tactile information, load bearing, joint position, space. So it receives information that way and can also make motor decisions. What that means is it's opened up a whole nother range of therapies or knowledge that we have to develop therapies that will help people recover. It's like you suddenly have a new way to approach rehabilitation and recovery for people with spinal cord injury.
And as I recall, Susie Harkema was putting devices in the back or something like that, a stimulator or something like that.
So that's correct.
Do you do the same thing with kids or not?
We do not.
Okay. So that's the difference.
That is a different. But let's look at it this way.
Okay.
It's very early in the stages of science for using those stimulators. I think her first article may have come out in 2012, but it's accelerating rapidly. By doing that, they're giving us knowledge about how the nervous system works. So it's going to be a while before we implant those in children for many obvious reasons. Right. But the science that she's doing is guiding us in how we develop therapies. They're all in the same family. They all have the same basic understanding of the biology of how the nervous system works.
Right. We're talking with Andrea Behrman, who's on the faculty at the University of Louisville. She's also with the Kentucky Spinal Cord Injury Research Center, and she works with kids who have spinal cord injuries and trying to rehab them and hopefully at some point get them to stand and perhaps take steps on their own. I want to talk about Malcolm. It's a little boy that I met the other day down at your place, down at Fraser Rehab Center. Tell us a little bit about Malcolm and what you are doing with him to try and get him through rehabilitation and through the process that you go through with these kids.
So often we see children, what I'm going to say, have chronic injuries. That means they've been injured over a year. There's typically no hope for those children given to them by the medical community. Basically, they're saying that you need to adapt to living in a wheelchair and go on with your life. And that child came to us after having an injury early on in his age.
Well, the injury was that he had a tumor next to his spine, and to get the tumor out, they
had to excise that tumor,
Right.
remove the tumor. The tumor created pressure otherwise that injured the spinal cord, left him paralyzed, most of his trunk muscles and his leg muscles. His arms are in good shape. His mother, I remember the first phone call from her, and she said, "My child can propel a wheelchair, he can even transfer, but he's not any better." And you have to ask yourself, what did that mother mean by better? And her reference is, how did my child function the day before this tragedy
surgery,
in his life? And so he had difficulty even sitting up straight. So he have to use his arms to hold himself up. So that was one of the major pieces, because as soon as you can sit up, you can use your arms freely in the world to play, engage. And children who are injured under age 10, there's 100% incidence of developing what we call scoliosis, or a curvature of the spine. That threat also means you ultimately are likely going to have surgery. That's a lot of cost, money, risk of infection and other things like that. So we'd like to avoid that as well.
So the mom was looking for what? I mean, obviously in a perfect world, pie in the sky, she'd love for her kid to be able to walk again, but that's probably not going to happen. So what was she looking for? I think I called it baby steps. You use some other term.
I said inch stones is what instead of
stones,
milestones,
yeah.
parents use that word because it's an iterative process. It's a small step forward. It's not like we leap into recovery. As soon as they recover one aspect, then we think it opens a door to another and to another. So this particular mother, her emphasis was, I'd like him to be able to sit up straight on his own, and then perhaps prevent scoliosis.
And so that's where you are right now. So you're working with Malcolm.
That's right.
All right, and this takes us into the talk of our a new device that you've got to try and help Malcolm rehab. So why don't you try and describe what that device is to folks on the radio who can't see it?
Okay, so that's a good way to look at it. Imagine taking a child. Malcolm's just turned 5, but imagine a child that's young as 2 years of age, and you want to put a child on a treadmill. Now, just that thought doesn't make any sense, right? No child gets on a treadmill.
Right.
I mean, you don't go to the gym and see children. All right, so we are using a treadmill as a therapeutic environment. But we have been using, let's just take the treadmill for a minute, an adult-sized treadmill. It's huge. So put a 2-year-old in the middle of a treadmill, and they're a foot away from you already. And you're sitting from the trainers who are sitting at the side, or from engaging. And then that treadmill is so long, well, child's step length or stride length is not that long. So again, just the size of the treadmill and then the access. So we have 2 trainers sitting on each side of the treadmill who are going to help access the legs. They're going to help facilitate the legs move, just like they're walking.
They grab the leg, just so people get a visual on this. They grab the kid's legs and move them on the treadmill as the treadmill's going.
I appreciate the word grab, and I'm going to accept that as a term, as a scientific term. But we use the word facilitate, or they're actually touching the legs. They're not like a robot, so they don't grab on secure tightly, but they facilitate the movements of those legs in a way that looks like walking. If you could magically remove them for a minute, you would say, oh, that child's walking on a treadmill. Right. But in order to make that happen, we have trainers on each side on the legs, and then we have one sitting behind them that helps with their pelvis. Right. Now, these are children that are paralyzed. They can't stand up on their own. So we have to have a system, and we call it partial body weight support, somehow that suspends them, not fully in the air, but partially, or unweights them.
It's a harness kind of thing.
So a harness is attached to the child, just like if you were rock climbing. It's a very good analogy.
That is a good analogy.
All right, so you wear this rock climbing type harness, but we're going to describe that as also a specially designed piece of equipment. And then there's a rope overhead, which is attached to an elaborate system to help support you.
But the bottom line on this is you had to come up with something that was smaller that fit kids
That's right.
to go through this rehab.
Right. And so, again, we had been providing the therapy with a system designed for adults.
Right.
Over time, it was like, finally I was scratching my head, I said, why do we keep doing this? So we can design one for children. We even went to manufacturers of major equipment and asked them about designing a treadmill, and they were like, no, just use the one we have right here. No interest.
You said, no, it doesn't work. It's too
It
big.
doesn't
It's
work.
6 feet long. It's made for adults. Too wide.
Too wide.
Okay.
I mean,
so now you got something that works.
yes.
The thing that was kind of cool about this whole thing to me was that you knew you had to come up with a different device and a different treadmill for smaller people, for kids that you could work with. So you went to the engineering department over here at the University of Louisville and said, hey, can you help me design something like that? Isn't that pretty much what you did?
That's correct. Now, we had one opportunity for funding here at the university. It was called the Coulter Translational Award. And that, juxtaposed to our problem, introduced a funding mechanism to give us time and resources to work on this problem. And that funding mechanism required a clinician, I'll be the clinician, and an engineer to partner together to work on a medical device that has a specific medical or clinical need, and to develop that item, but take it all the way to manufacturing. They just don't want you to develop it and have it sit, all the way to market. And so, yes, we partnered with an engineer.
Who was?
Thomas Roussel, the bioengineer.
Give him credit.
Absolutely. So that partnership came to fruition. We applied for this Coulter Translational Award. It's an interesting process. They offer you the opportunity to do something like Shark Tank. So you had 5 minutes to tell your story.
Had to make a pitch.
Make a pitch. I thought it was great. And it's a bit of a grueling process to work with them.
Yeah.
Because they are just like the people you see on Shark Tank.
Yeah.
Like,
I know.
But it was an incredibly valuable process because they walk you through this. I'd never done that before. I'm a physical therapist and a researcher. Tommy's an engineer. He probably had more experience taking things to market than I did.
Right. The bottom line for this, though, is that U of L is one of the few places that got the Coulter Grant money, and this is a university that could do that. They could take this concept that you had, this idea that you had, put it into play with an engineer, and get it to market, where now, as I understand it, there are people in other cities that are buying this new child treadmill for kids at their hospitals and their rehab places, right?
That's right. They're going to Pittsburgh, New York, Houston, Texas. So there are already people interested in this particular device because it allows you to provide this therapy very successfully.
So what's the benefit for kids? Bottom line, what's the benefit for kids out of this treadmill and the work that you're doing?
It's an opportunity to receive this therapy in a very efficient and effective manner. And that means for children, they may be able to, children who couldn't sit can now sit up. Children that could stand may be able to stand. They might even be able to take steps. And even more importantly, recently, we've had a child that came off a ventilator to be able to breathe on his own through this particular therapy.
Because the spinal cord injuries present other health problems, not just the severed spinal cord.
That's correct.
All right. But you're giving hope to parents and to kids.
Absolutely.
Well, congratulations, as always. It's always great talking to you, and glad you got the new treadmill up and working, and hopefully that'll help kids in the future.
Thank you very much.
Andrea Behrman, always good to see you. Thanks for listening to U of L Today with Mark Hebert, and go Cards.